What do you think of when you hear the word God? What comes to your mind when someone invokes God casually in a conversation? To be clear, I'm not talking about theologians, apologists, or even active believers. I'm talking about everyday people who, in many cases, are not having an evangelistic or spiritual episode, just simply filling in an empty space in a sentence or a moment with a word that feels somehow socially appropriate, even when theologically irrelevant. The phenomenon I'm speaking of is often referred to as taking the name of God in vain, which basically means treating God's name or identity in an empty, irreverent, or untruthful manner. And that's basically the type of usage today's video is about. In highly radicalized circles on both extremes of the spectrum, even mentioning the word God casually is often interpreted as active belief. Casually saying God bless you or thank God to a hypervigilant believer may result in assumptions of shared faith with the hearer. Saying it to a militant atheist, not to be confused with a vocal atheist, may result in an assumption of attempted conversion. And while these assumptions are absolutely true in a minority of cases, I've noticed in an increasing number of cases, people are not actually invoking any specific religious God, but what we'll call, for the sake of today's conversation, the most common God. The God invoked most frequently in everyday society may not be any defined theological or philosophical God at all. From my vantage point, it seems to be a socially inherited, theologically vacant God whose name functions as shared language for emotion, uncertainty, hope, gratitude, powerlessness, exaggeration, and even social ritual. This is about the difference between God as a theological being and God as a cultural expression. People frequently use God as a figure of speech, idiom, or hyperbole completely disconnected from religious or theological meanings. This ranges from emotional emphasis to casual slang. Now, a few examples. We'll start with exclamations of surprise or frustration. These are often used to punctuate strong emotions like anger, shock, or relief, like when someone says, "Oh my God, I can't believe traffic is this bad." But then there's also metaphors for excellence or control, which is often used to describe someone with ultimate authority or exceptional skill in a certain domain, referring to sports stars as sports gods. But there's also idioms of probability. Phrases like God willing are often used simply to mean if everything goes as planned or hopefully. And then there's slang for superior quality, colloquially, a person of exceptional beauty or talent. She's an absolute goddess on the tennis court. And then there's also emphasis, used simply to add weight to a statement. It was the best move ever, honest to God. But these statements rarely ever represent an actual belief about a specific divine being. The speaker may not be thinking about Yahweh, Allah, Jesus, providence, scripture, or any defined or defended theology. In those moments, God looks less like an entity being described and more like a linguistic tool being used. But let's talk about why the most common God works. The most common God, based on my observation in 2 decades of experience in Christian ministry, is actually this undefined conversational God shared across religious, secular, doubtful, and even atheistic populations. This God has no consistent personality, no agreed upon doctrine, no specific scripture, no stable moral position, and often no clearly imagined existence. It's simply invoked whenever ordinary language reaches the edge of explanation or emotional intensity. There is an aspect of this that can be viewed as God as society. Emile Durkheim defined God as a symbolic representation of society itself. He argued that when people worship God, they are actually worshiping the supreme power, moral authority, and collective consciousness of their own community, which is why, in many cases of religious deconstruction, people often become disillusioned with the community before they can honestly interrogate the religious beliefs. In his 1912 work, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, Durkheim theorized that society transcends the individual. Because individuals depend on society for survival, language, and morals, they experience its binding power as external coercive force. People personify this immense social power and project it onto a divine figure, something bigger than the self. Ultimately, Durkheim viewed God as a collective representation that binds communities together by reinforcing shared values and social solidarity. None of us personally invented phrases like thank God or God willing. We inherited them from the culture. They were already circulating before we understood what the word God meant. That means people often learn to use God before they learn to define God. A child may say, "Oh my God," long before developing any coherent theology. An adult may stop believing in Christianity while continuing to say, "Thank God." The belief can disappear while the language remains. That is significant because it shows that God exists socially in ways that do not depend on God existing metaphysically. Now let's talk about why this conversation matters. We often assume that anyone who uses the word God is making a theological statement, and that assumption can muddy the waters of our perception of society. It's easy to feel like you're surrounded by believers when you're constantly hearing language that is often associated with belief. But think of it this way: how many people sing Christmas carols and hold no belief in a Santa Claus, a Frosty, or a red nosed reindeer named Rudolph? Consider also how many people say, God bless you, or some variation of it when someone sneezes while holding no belief that your soul is trying to escape your body. The point is that language has never really been a reliable indicator of belief. There are plenty of people who use religious language without holding religious belief because it's a part of their social language. Many have zero attachment to the words beyond the usage itself. And I'm willing to bet that the social users represent a larger percentage of society than the religious users. The social God seems to be much more common than any theological or philosophical God, but we spend much of our time ignoring the social users. And understandably so, as it's often not the social users who are allowing scriptural interpretation to determine how they'll treat others, vote, or otherwise engage reality. But there is a danger here. If we continue to assume language equates to a specific belief, we may unintentionally alienate those who hold the language without holding the belief. I think recognizing that distinction is crucial to the way we engage and understand the current climate. We hear God language everywhere and assume we're surrounded by committed believers when many of those people may simply be participating in a shared vocabulary. And this is not merely statistical. When atheists, humanists, or religious critics interpret every religious expression as evidence of deep belief, we may misunderstand potential allies, exaggerate the religious uniformity of society, and alienate people who are already psychologically or philosophically detached from religion but still speak its language. But when their inherited vocabulary is treated as a declaration of faith, they're often forced into a religious identity they may not claim. A believer may absorb them into the faithful, while an atheist may position them among the religious opposition. So, before we decide what someone believes based on the word God, we need to determine whether they're expressing a theology or simply speaking the language their culture gave them. The omnipresence of God language can make religious belief appear more universal, more coherent, more intentional, and more culturally dominant at the level of personal conviction than it may actually be. So, the more important question is not whether someone uses the word God, it's what authority, if any, that God holds in their life. Does God simply appear in their vocabulary, or does God determine what they believe is true? Does God fill an empty space in a sentence, or does God dictate how they vote, whom they trust, how they judge other people, and what freedoms they believe others should have? Those are not the same thing. Someone saying thank God after receiving good news is not necessarily making the same kind of religious claim as someone insisting that God created only one acceptable family structure and assigned permanent roles to men and women, condemns certain people for how they love, or expects the laws of society to reflect their interpretation of Scripture. One is using God as inherited language, the other is using God as an authority over reality and over other people. This distinction doesn't mean that social God language tells us nothing. Its prevalence reveals just how thoroughly religion has shaped our shared vocabulary. But it does mean that the presence of religious language cannot by itself tell us the depth, content, or consequence of someone's belief. Perhaps the better measure of religion is not how often God appears in someone's speech, but how much power God has given over their understanding of the world. Because the God who fills a sentence and the God who governs a society may be invoked by the same name, but they are not performing the same function. Now, to some, this may seem pedantic, but I think this is important in a larger conversation: reaching the people who share the most common God. The people who share the most common God may actually be among the easiest people to reach, but they'll probably require a different approach. Logical arguments against scripture, doctrine, miracles, or the attributes of God may have very little effect because those arguments are confronting a theology to which they have no meaningful attachment. You can't dismantle a belief system that's not actually governing the person's life. They may use the word God, defend the general idea of God, or even identify as believers while possessing no clearly defined supernatural claims they feel responsible for proving. For them, God may function less as an actual being and more as a placeholder for society itself, for shared values, belonging, hope, morality, comfort, or the sense that they're connected to something larger than themselves. Removing the word without addressing those social functions may feel less like correcting an idea and more like taking away a source of connection. That means they may be more responsive to community than argument. They may need conversations that allow them to examine their assumptions, challenge their understanding of the world, and develop more accurate language for what they already believe without being pressured to adopt another rigid identity. The goal should not be to force them to conform to atheism in the same way religion once expected conformity from them. It should be to create spaces where they can think honestly, belong without pretending, and discover that meaning, morality, wonder, and community do not depend upon maintaining a God they never clearly believed in to begin with. And if that sounds like the kind of space you need, I want to invite you to join us at Bridge City. Bridge City is a community for people who want to keep questioning, keep growing, and keep building meaningful lives beyond superstition. You don't have to arrive with the right label, the right answers, or a finished worldview. You just have to be willing to think honestly, engage openly, and build community without being forced to conform. We meet on Sundays for conversations focused on personal growth and community development. And then throughout the week, our members host community events like songwriting workshops, tabletop RPGs, and even movie nights. So come, connect better, build better, and live better with us at Bridge City. The link is in the description below. And as always, thank you for sharing your time with me today. And until next time, keep rising.